afternoon, or good morning, everybody. So I'm a biologist with the USGS Great Lakes Science Center based out of Oswego. And the lake trout rehabilitation program in Lake Ontario involves a number of partners. The stuff I'm going to be talking about today is mostly on the US side, just for consistency, and mostly talking about assessment data. So the groups that participate in this are USGS and New York DEC, and also help from the Fish and Wildlife Service as well. Brief background, so lake trout in Lake Ontario were considered to be about extirpated by the 1950s. This is a graph of commercial harvest from Canada and US waters. So they serve as our apex predator in the system, and aside from overfishing, there's also other threats that face lake trout as well. Sea lamprey predation, we heard some talks earlier about thiamine deficiency caused by alewife, and also habitat degradation. Early attempts to restore the population started before the 1950s by stocking fry. However, didn't really show much success because sea lamprey hadn't been controlled yet. So starting in the 1970s with the initiation of sea lamprey control and annual stocking of juvenile lake trout began across the Great Lakes, we started to see efforts to rebuild an adult stock. And it's pretty cool, like the lake trout restoration program all throughout the Great Lakes is probably one of the biggest species restoration programs worldwide. Ton of literature out about this. The Lake Ontario specific one, I think is well summarized in this paper by Elrod et al. 1995. So throughout this program, there's been a number of different strains that have been stocked, and a lake trout strain is basically just a population from a different lake or a different area within a lake. So this is just a brief summary of some of them. It's been millions. The y-axis is spring yearling equivalents because there have been fall fingerlings stocked as well. And I'm going to focus today on this what I'm calling the contemporary period, and I'll sort of justify that why later, but basically it has the most kind of consistent strains. So we have 4 different strains being stocked in this period. Why have different strains been used? There's 2 sort of different documents that have, some of the overlap, but the management strategy for lake trout kind of specifies why. Basically the goal was to maximize genetic diversity, kind of like throwing darts at a dartboard. We want to see what sticks and what works, and ultimately develop a strain that is well adapted to the current environment in Lake Ontario. Another reason why different strains have been used is just what's available in the hatchery at the time of stocking. So starting in 1979, the use of coded wire tags were used in lake trout that were stocked, and you can use this information to get back at some of the stocking practices and track strain-specific performance. There's been some papers out that suggest since the 2000s, the Seneca Lake strain, which is also sometimes from other lakes, so kind of a Finger Lake strain, is generally the preferred strain because of better adult survival and lower mortality from sea lamprey predation. This is a picture of some of the morphological diversity of different ecotypes in Lake Superior. Leans on the top, humper, which are a smaller form, ciscoette, and then redfin. So throughout the Lake Ontario program of stocking, it's been predominantly lean strains. This isn't even all of the strains that have been stocked, but this is kind of some of the majority ones. And the thought is that these different forms in Lake Superior, there's been a lot of really cool studies that have shown that they vary in terms of life history traits, feeding ecology, and distribution throughout the lake. There has been one strain that's been considered to be a humper strain. So this was developed from Klondike Reef in Lake Superior. It was intended to be a humper strain to sort of diversify the mix of strains that have been stocked in the lake. It's been stocked in Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and Lake Michigan. And it might be capable of using offshore reef areas, given where it was found, and may have different feeding ecology. However, in talking with people that actually developed the broodstock for this, after it was developed, there was actually some question whether it was purely a humper strain. There's multiple forms that use this spawning area in the Klondike Reef, and it's probably more likely that there's actually some leans and ciscoettes and maybe even redfins that were contributing to this broodstock. I talked about coated wire tags, just for those of you who aren't familiar. They're shown here on the finger. There's no way you can see that from the back of the room, but they're smaller than a piece of a grain of rice, and they're inserted in the snout of a lake trout prior to stocking, and it has a little number on it that we can, once we catch it, we can use a magnet to detect it, and then we read it and link it with all the stocking information, so we can get age, strain composition throughout the lake, and know where it was stocked and when. The current status of lake trout rehabilitation in Lake Ontario, we've managed to rebuild the stock. This is a graph of abundance throughout time, and you can see it might look like it's declining, but that's just because stocking levels have changed throughout time to maintain forage base. So overall, there's an abundant stock. Body condition, so the weight at a given length. This is the predicted weight of a 700 millimeter trout. Has shown a pretty good increase. So the fish seem to have pretty good body condition out there. Maximum age detected from these coated wire tags. We've been seeing that sort of increase through time. There's fish over 30 years old out in the system, so meaning they're surviving to pretty big ages. Sea lamprey wounding control. The earlier part of this graph on the left side was prior to full-blown implementation of the lamprey control program. Since then, we've seen pretty remarkably well-controlled population of sea lamprey. We had a little bit of a spike during COVID when the management team couldn't go out there and control the systems. And that's led to overall pretty high adult survival of different strains. The management target shown by the dashed line is 60% adult survival, and for the most part, we've seen that. But the enigma for us is, why are we seeing substantial recruitment of wild fish? Wild fish, this is a graph of adults. It's, I think the highest point was about 6%, but overall it's generally like 1 to 2% in our catches. So the objectives of this talk, I wanted to compare performance metrics, basic life history parameters, and some of the ecology among 4 different strains. And I chose this contemporary period because 2008 was the first year class of Klondikes that were stocked in the system. So the question that we had was, do Klondikes show differences compared to some of the lean strains? And lean strains focusing here at Seneca Lake, Finger Lakes, Lake Champlain, and this other one, Lake Huron Perry Sound, that comes from Lake Huron in the Perry Sound area of Georgian Bay, that was first used in 2015. And I'll also add that the Klondike strain is no longer available for stocking, so the current mix of stocking is these, the other 3 forms right now. And the other reason for kind of focusing on this contemporary period was to relate what we're seeing in Lake Ontario to another study that's been done in Lake Erie, using the same mix of strains and kind of basically do a common garden experiment between the results that they have from Lake Erie to what we have in Lake Ontario. So the data is all comes from this annual GillNet survey. This is our survey effort from 2025. We fish in these different geographic areas. They're kind of zones throughout the lake, try to spread it out on the US side. And we record things: length, sex, maturity, stomach contents. I already talked about how we determine stocks of fish and look up the coated wire tags. And if you're interested, there's reports on the Fish Commission website, annual reports produced every year. There has been some effort on the Canadian side that we did last year as a binational effort, but I won't go over that today. Jumping right into the results. So survival, we used standard catch curve analysis. Each little plot here, starting with the year class, this is 2008 year class down to 2018 year class, and each color is a different strain. Overall, average survival was 69%, but it's quite a big range from 25 to 91%. Survival was similar among year classes. There was no significant difference there, but we did see the significant difference in survival among strains. So the Klondike Reef strain, shown here in yellow, had significantly lower survival compared to Seneca and Lake Champlain, and Huron Perry Sound was not significantly different from the others. Growth. So mentioned earlier, the Klondike reef strain, thought to be a humper type strain, is supposed to be show a lower maximum length at maturity. And so what you can't really see too well in the graph here is that these Seneca and Lake Champlain were nearly identical in terms of their theoretical maximum length. The lines overlap almost right on top of each other for those. Klondikes were notably lower, about 100 millimeters lower maximum length. And here on Parry Sound, it appears to grow fast, but this is kind of skewed because we don't have data more recently. Like I said, the first year class stock was 2015, so from like age 10, the most recent data. The weight accumulation with length also seemed to show some differences. This is just standard length-weight regression. So in general, if you have a B coefficient that's greater than 3, it shows there's allometric growth. Klondikes in yellow here, their B was 3.42, so slightly higher than the other ones. And they're actually showed significance between Seneca and Lake Champlain, but they weren't significantly different from Huron and Parry Sound. Another way of looking at this, which actually saw that, I gotta redo this one, I don't think it's quite right, because Huron and Parry Sound, something's up there. But we do see this significantly different. This is the predicted weight of different size fish, so a 700 millimeter fish. You can see that's about 200 grams higher if you're a Klondike compared to the lean forms. Just ignore the Huron and Parry Sound one for now. And we think that might be explaining in part the recent relatively high conditions we've seen in lake trout in the past 4 or 5 survey years because these Klondikes are recruiting to the adult population. Similar to what we kind of expected for Klondikes based on knowledge from Lake Superior is that, again, I apologize for the change in colors here, but Klondikes here in purple reach maturity at smaller sizes compared to Lake Champlain and Seneca, which again are relatively identical. Sea lamprey wounding rates, another metric, so this is an example of a A1 sea lamprey wound, I believe. Can't quite see that one, but the smaller, and this is broken up by size classes here, so within this size bin, 530 to 630, you can see this is a percentage of lake trout that showed these different wound categories. They seem to be higher than the other forms or other strains. But at sizes over 632 millimeters, doesn't seem to be a clear distinction between Klondikes versus the lean forms. How about diet? The two primary prey are alewife and round goby in the system. So we just used stomach content data, frequency of occurrence, and alewife were found in over 70% of Seneca and Lake Champlain diets, right here, and 50% in Klondike diets and Huron Parry Sound. If you look at round goby, it's the opposite, so lower amounts of round goby were detected in Seneca and Lake Champlain, and we expected to see more in Klondikes. That was true, but we were also kind of surprised to see that Huron Parry Sound fish, in terms of feeding, seem to be a little bit more similar to Klondikes than they would some of the lean forms. So I mentioned there was a previous study in Lake Erie led by Mark Rogers et al. And so he compared humber, Klondikes, to the leans, which are Seneca, Lake Champlain, and also some superior lean forms. So I'm just going to walk through comparing our results to what Mark found. And in terms of survival, we found nearly the same result. Mark found that Klondikes had about 57% survival versus leans of 82. Our results were strikingly similar, 53% versus 74 to 79%. Growth, again, similar conclusion reached from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. Klondikes have a lower growth rate and theoretical maximum length in both systems. Weight accumulation, Klondikes were heavier at length. Maturity, same situation again. Wounds from sea lamprey, Mark showed that Klondikes tended to be wounded more from lake sea lamprey, but there's kind of a lack of a difference in our study, except for that one size bin that I showed. Diet, Klondikes in Lake Erie tended to eat more goby compared to smelt. Smelt's not a really primary forage in Lake Ontario. We have alewife instead, that's the primary forage. So we did see that Klondikes ate more goby, but it wasn't different than what we think is another lean strain, the Huron Prairie Soundfish. So like I mentioned, our diet results pretty much agree with Lake Erie. They also tend to agree with some of the stuff like that Caleb showed earlier for fatty acid analysis. This is another example from Aaron Heisey's master's work, looking at, I believe it was fatty acids as well, and he also did diamond, in showing that Klondikes have a difference between Lake Champlain and Seneca. There's also another study from stable isotopes and PCB, so contaminants, and showed that Klondikes, I think here in the orange, tend to show some distinction between some of the other forms. So the conclusions, this question sort of rings in my mind, what's the winner, right? Like if I'm bringing this information to a manager, is there a standout performer or strain diversity the real winner for ecosystem resilience? I'm unfortunately, I can't answer that, but I guess it'll have to depend on what the natural reproduction starts to show in terms of genetics. But nonetheless, I do think that this work shows some trade-offs between different strains. They have implications for rehabilitation strategies. We saw that different strains use different prey. If you're trying to manage for a fishery that has big fish, Klondikes seem to not reach that size. Seneca and Lake Champlain kind of surprised us, but maybe not super surprising. They seem to perform nearly identical. Huron Prairie Sound seems to have some differences. This is a strain that's currently being used, and as well with Seneca and Lake Champlain. So it'd be interesting to see how this one tends to differ and why it differs. The Klondikes tended to be the most different, and our results were largely upheld when we compared it to Lake Erie. And that's all I got. I'll take any questions you have.